I never thought that a leftover meal could save my entire life. It sounds like the opening line of a story that has been retold countless times. But for me, it is a simple truth with a hint of bitterness every time I remember it. That afternoon, like any other day, I left the office later than usual. The yellow lights in the lobby of the Mission Valley building reflected on the old, yet gentle face of the security guard, Harold Green. I didn't know since when that sight had become a familiar part of my life. I consider myself an introverted person who lives simply and has little social interaction. In my marketing job in San Diego, I still completed my tasks but never tried to connect with anyone. Every day I brought my lunch, and sometimes, because of being busy or losing my appetite, I couldn't finish it. The first times I brought the leftover food downstairs for Harold were simply because I didn't want to waste it. But somehow, it became a habit, and gradually I realized I was looking forward to seeing his grateful smile each evening. Harold always ate very slowly, as if every bite was precious. Each time I placed the food box on his footrest and said, "I'll leave this here for you." He always looked at me with an expression that was hard to describe. A bit of gratitude, a bit of shyness, and perhaps a bit of warmth he had not felt in a long time. Many times I asked myself why an elderly man like him still had to work night shifts at an office building. But I never asked deeply, thinking it was his personal matter. Then one evening, as I sat on the steps next to him while waiting for my Uber, I happened to see his hand trembling. He quietly wiped the corner of his eye and turned away as if afraid I would notice. I gently asked, "Are you okay, sir?" He smiled, but his smile was so fragile that I could feel the loneliness seeping through every wrinkle on his face. He slowly said that his dog, Buddy, was very ill, and his old house in Chula Vista sometimes leaked when it rained heavily. I didn't know how to react, so I just placed my hand on his shoulder and said honestly, "If you ever need anything, just tell me." That moment helped me understand Harold more. An old man living a quiet, lonely life. Losing his wife, having no children, clinging to his security job as a way not to sink into a bottomless void. I found myself caring about him more than before. Not pity, but genuine empathy. That night, before I left, Harold told me something I didn't understand at the time. "Roman, you're kinder to me than you think." But everything became clearer when one evening, Harold no longer kept his usual calm demeanor. I brought him a leftover pasta box, but he didn't take it immediately, and instead looked at me for a long time, as if struggling with something. I asked, "Is there something wrong, sir?" He nodded and sighed. He said that recently he had seen me meeting some strangers in the lobby, a blonde woman named Tracy Powell and a tall, thin man named Alex Turner. I nodded, telling him they were real estate agents who introduced me to a plot of land in Riverside that I was considering investing in. I even told Harold about the price, the upcoming highway development, and the potential for quick profit. When I said that, Harold froze. His eyes changed, more serious than I had ever seen them. "Don't transfer any money tonight, Roman. Please," he said with a trembling voice. I was startled. "What do you mean, sir?" Harold stepped closer and whispered, "I know those two people. They used to show up at the building I worked at before, and 3 people lost everything because of them." I froze. Time seemed to stop for a few seconds. Harold looked straight into my eyes, his gaze full of worry. "If you trust me, don't make any decisions tonight. Tomorrow, I have something important to show you." The Uber arrived. I got in the car with my mind spinning. I looked back at Harold standing under the yellow lobby light, his figure thin but strangely firm. His words echoed in my head throughout the entire ride home. I had never heard him say anything with such seriousness. That night, I lay in bed unable to sleep. A part of me wanted to trust Tracy and Alex. They were too professional, too convincing. But another part, a much bigger part, could not forget the look in the eyes of that old man who always ate the meals I brought down each night. He had no reason to deceive me, no benefit from interfering with my financial decisions. He had only one thing: kindness. And my instincts told me Harold never spoke such words without reason. I just didn't know yet that the leftover meals I absent-mindedly brought down had created a connection between 2 lonely souls. And it was precisely that connection that made Harold watch over me enough to save me from a fall I would never recover from. That was the night I realized my life was about to take a different turn. And it all started from a small action I once thought meant nothing. The next morning I woke up with a feeling suspended between doubt and confusion. Sunlight passed through the window of my small apartment in San Diego, but the heaviness of Harold's warning from last night still pressed on my chest. I made a cup of coffee but couldn't bring myself to drink it because my mind kept circling around the image of Tracy and Alex smiling professionally. I remembered clearly how Tracy showed me the planning map and asserted that a new highway would run through the land. Everything looked so legitimate that even the most skeptical person would have nodded. But then I remembered Harold's eyes, the eyes of someone experienced, someone who had witnessed too much loss. A man like him would not worry about me to that extent without reason. I turned off all message notifications from Tracy and Alex. I went to work but couldn't concentrate. All morning, I stared at my computer screen without accomplishing anything. The sound of coworkers typing, the printer running, phones ringing, all of it became background noise in a mind that was about to explode. At noon, as I was heading down to the lobby, my phone rang again. It was Tracy. Her voice was as sweet as the first day we met. "Roman, I can take you to see the land today. The developer wants to close soon." I took a deep breath and said, "Let me check my schedule." Then I hung up immediately, my hand trembling strangely. I told myself not to let greed overshadow reason, even though I had no idea where the truth lay. When I arrived at the lobby, Harold was sitting in his usual chair. As soon as he saw me, he stood up abruptly, as if he had been waiting a long time. "Meet me at 7 tonight, behind the building, in the parking lot," he said quickly. I nodded without asking anything. Something about his urgency made it impossible to take lightly. The entire afternoon I felt like sitting on burning coal, checking the clock every few minutes. At 7, the back parking lot was nearly empty, with only a few cars left. The dim yellow lights cast long shadows on the ground. Harold was leaning against a pillar, holding a thick envelope. When I approached, he handed it to me. "Open it," he said, his voice low. I opened it and found photocopied documents along with a few blurry screenshots. An image of Tracy smiling in another meeting, Alex shaking hands with a man, and both of them listed as suspected fraud on the California government website. I couldn't believe my eyes. The documents Harold collected showed they had appeared in at least 2 other office buildings, approaching people who wanted to invest in real estate, then vanishing after receiving deposits. I flipped through each page, my hand trembling. "How did you get all this?" I asked in disbelief. Harold sat down on the bench in the parking lot, his eyes distant. "I met people like them before. 3 people in the old building were scammed, and none of them got a cent back." He told the story with a choked voice. An old man who used all his savings for a deposit. A single mother persuaded to invest in subdivided land. An immigrant taken advantage of because he didn't understand the laws. Each story cut into me like a blade. "How long have you been following them?" I asked. Harold answered without hesitation. "Since the first day I saw them appear here with you." I was stunned. "Why do you care about me that much?" Harold looked at me for a long moment, as if weighing something. "Because I see myself in you. I used to trust people too easily, and I paid a heavy price." He clenched his hands. "I don't want you to repeat my mistake." I stayed silent. Something flowed through me, a sense of gratitude, a bit of regret, and a vague fear that I had almost fallen into a real trap. In that moment, I realized Harold was not just the security guard who received my leftover meals every night. He looked at me like family, as if he felt responsible for protecting me from what he himself had once gone through. "Roman," he said softly, "don't meet them alone anymore, and let me help you this time." I nodded, my throat tightening. Everything suddenly felt too real, too close, and too dangerous. Harold's voice was calm, but full of warning. "They won't give up. Tomorrow they'll definitely look for you to push the deposit. But this time, you're not going alone. I already have a plan." I looked at Harold, the old man with deep-set eyes but filled with a determination I had never seen. In the dim parking lot, with the wind stirring the lights overhead, I knew for certain that my life had just reached a turning point. A turning point I never expected, all beginning from a leftover meal I had casually left in the lobby. The next evening, When the clock hands had just reached 6:30, I was already standing in the parking lot. The feeling of anxiety and anticipation intertwined with every breath. I didn't know what else Harold intended to tell me, but my intuition told me this would be an important conversation, one that could change the entire direction of my coming days. The parking lot was so quiet that I could clearly hear the wind blowing through the metal barriers. A few remaining cars were lined up, their shadows stretched across the cold ground. At exactly 7 o'clock, Harold appeared. He walked slowly, but there was something steady in his steps. In his hand was not an envelope this time, but a small file bag. "Roman," he called me, and just hearing his voice, I knew this wasn't simple. We sat down on a bench in the hidden corner of the parking lot where the lights didn't reach. The feeling of preparing to hear a big secret made my body alternately warm and cold. Harold placed the file bag down, clasped his hands together, and let out a long, deep sigh. "I'm going to tell you everything I know," he said. "But first, I want you to promise me one thing." I looked at him, waiting. "Promise that no matter how crazy what I say sounds, you will listen to all of it before making any decision." His words startled me a bit, but I still nodded. "I promise." Harold opened the file bag and took out a clipped stack of papers. On the first page was a picture of Tracy and Alex in a CCTV shot from another building. But what sent chills down my spine were the words underneath. "Involved in previous real estate scams. Under investigation." The documents he gave me last night were enough to make me cautious, but today was different. There were official reports, along with statements from former victims. Harold told me that 3 years ago, he worked as a security guard at an office building in Escondido. 2 real estate agents who looked exactly like Tracy and Alex appeared, polite and professional at first. But after a few months, several people in the building lost tens of thousands of dollars. No one recovered their money. Harold had tried to warn others, but no one believed him, until everything happened. "They don't just take money," he said slowly. "They take people's lives." Harold's voice choked when he mentioned an old man, the first victim. He put nearly all his savings as a deposit for a lot of land supposedly near a future casino. After being scammed, he nearly collapsed mentally. "Roman, do you know the helpless feeling of watching an old man cry? Watching him lose everything and not being able to do anything?" Harold asked. I couldn't answer. I just lowered my head and looked at my hands. Then he told me about a single mother with 2 children. She was convinced to invest in a new resort land project, and only a month later, she stood in the parking lot crying her heart out when she learned all the documents were fake. Harold could do nothing except call the police and watch her life crumble. When he told this part, I realized Harold wasn't just talking about scams. He was talking about a wound in his heart. A wound that had never healed. "I saw you meeting them," Harold said softly. "And I knew you would become the next victim." He didn't say that to scare me, but as if he had already seen that future clearly, inevitably. "But this time," Harold said, his eyes filled with determination, "I won't let that happen." I was speechless. I had never seen Harold so strong. An old, lonely man, but with a sense of responsibility and perseverance I had never seen in anyone else. He seemed to carry all the mistakes of the past on his shoulders and was determined to correct them at any cost. "Harold," I didn't know what to say. Only gratitude rose and tightened my throat. He continued, "Tomorrow they will definitely look for you. They will say someone else wants to put down a deposit, that you must decide quickly. It's their old tactic." I recalled Tracy's words yesterday. "If you don't close today, the opportunity will be gone forever." That sentence suddenly became more terrifying than ever. Harold said we needed to contact the police, but we had to gather enough evidence, and he had already collected almost everything before I even knew anything. I widened my eyes. "How long have you been watching them?" Harold looked at me and answered quietly. "Since the first day they spoke with you." I didn't know whether to be afraid or touched, but the strongest feeling in me then was absolute trust. Harold had nothing to gain by helping me. He just wanted to protect me, the way he once wanted to protect others, but failed. When the conversation ended, I stood up and looked at Harold in the dim yellow light. An old man with thin hands, a wrinkled face, tired eyes. But in his eyes, there was a flame of courage no one would expect. At that moment, I understood that Harold didn't see me as a random young man. He saw me as part of a family he never had again. When I left the parking lot that night, my heart was heavy with thoughts. But at the same time, I felt a strange sense of steadiness. I was no longer alone in this. And perhaps, I had never been alone since the first time I placed a leftover meal in front of Harold. Only, I didn't realize it. That night I sat for a long time by the window, watching the city lights of San Diego flicker. I knew the next day would not be easy, and the truth would reveal things that would shock me even more. The next morning, I walked into the office with an indescribably heavy feeling. I had barely slept because of everything Harold told me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the victims from his story. The old man, the single mother, the immigrant unfamiliar with the law. All of them seemed to remind me that I had almost become the next one. I sat at my desk, but my mind was nowhere near the present. The ticking clock felt like a countdown to the meeting I couldn't avoid. Around 10 in the morning, Tracy called. I stared at the screen for a long time, not wanting to answer, but eventually picked up. "Roman, have you thought about it? I'm free this afternoon. We can finalize the contract today." She sounded calm, but for the first time I sensed a hint of unusual urgency in her tone. I tried to stay calm and replied, "I have something this afternoon. I'll see." Tracy paused for a few seconds, then said something that sent chills down my spine. "I hope you won't let someone else take this opportunity." I hung up, my heart racing. Harold had been right. They would try to pressure me. And this was only the beginning. Around 3 in the afternoon, Alex called next. His tone was tense, no longer gentle like before. "Roman, the developer needs someone to close. If you don't put down the deposit by 5, they'll give it to someone else." I responded briefly, "I'll think about it." But this time, Alex didn't let it go. "You have to decide. This is a rare opportunity, and we've been holding it for you." He sounded more like he was issuing an order than negotiating. I hung up again and knew I couldn't stall much longer. Harold told me that tonight they would want to meet in person to pressure me. And sure enough, shortly after, Tracy sent a message. "Meet me at 6:30 p.m. at the Old Town Cafe. I'll bring the original contract." I rushed down to the lobby to find Harold. When he saw me, he immediately understood. He nodded and said, "We'll get there first, and you won't sit alone." I looked at him, feeling as if I were relying on a father I never truly had. We arrived in Old Town at 6:15. The sky was already dim, streetlights casting warm yellow glows against the old brick walls. The cafe was on a corner, busy yet quiet. Harold sat 2 tables away from me, pretending to read a newspaper. I sat at the table as planned, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. My hands were ice cold. At exactly 6:30, Tracy walked in. She wore a beige long coat, her face smiling brightly as usual. Alex followed behind with a document briefcase. They approached my table with such natural charm that if I didn't know the truth, I would have felt safe around them. "Roman, I knew you'd come," Tracy said as she sat. Alex placed the briefcase on the table and opened it. "Here's the contract. You just need to sign and put down the deposit today." I pretended to stay calm, asked a few questions to stall, just as Harold instructed. Tracy began to lose her patience. "Roman, this is a real opportunity. Don't let someone else take it." Alex added, "You trust us, right? We've helped many other clients." That sentence made my throat tighten. I glanced toward Harold. He subtly nodded, reminding me to stay steady. I opened the contract, pretending to question details. Alex leaned in, saying, "That part isn't important. What matters is we close today." Tracy pressed her lips together, clearly struggling to maintain her gentle persona. When the tension peaked, Alex handed me the pen. "Sign it, Roman. Opportunities don't come twice." The moment seemed frozen. I looked straight into their eyes, no longer afraid. Harold stood from the table behind me and walked closer. Tracy and Alex turned sharply, but couldn't react in time, because only seconds later, Police officers arrived. Two uniformed officers approached our table. One said, "Tracy Powell, Alex Turner, you are suspected of involvement in multiple real estate fraud cases. Please come with us." Tracy froze, then began shouting, "You're mistaken. I only follow client requests." Alex tried to stand and run, but he was immediately restrained. I sat still, my heart pounding violently inside my chest. Harold placed his hand on my shoulder, light but steady. "It's over, Roman. You're safe now." His voice was deep but strong. I looked at him, my eyes stinging, unable to say a word. People around us stared with curiosity, but everything felt blurry. Only Harold remained clear, standing like a protective wall between me and a world full of traps I had nearly fallen into. When the police took Tracy and Alex away, I exhaled like someone who had just stepped back from a cliff. Harold looked at me, offering a tired but warm smile. "I told you," he whispered. "I won't let you become the next one." And in that moment, I knew my life had changed forever. I had never felt my legs so weak as I did when stepping out of the Old Town Cafe that night. My heart was still pounding as if my body hadn't realized yet that I was no longer in danger. Harold walked beside me, his figure slightly hunched, but every step steady, as though he had long been accustomed to facing storms on behalf of others. When we reached the parking lot, Harold placed his hand on the car hood and exhaled deeply, like someone who had just released a burden carried for years. "I'm sorry for dragging you into something so big," he said softly. I shook my head immediately. "No, you saved me. If I had gone alone tonight—" I couldn't finish the sentence. My throat tightened. Harold simply nodded, his eyes sunken but filled with a very clear sense of relief. We stood silently for a few seconds under the yellow streetlights as the wind rustled the leaves. The next day, the police contacted me for an official statement. I sat in a small investigation room, the smell of paper and old coffee mixed together. Officer Daniels was the one interviewing me. Middle-aged, calm, professional. I told him everything, every detail, from the first time Tracy approached me to the moment they were arrested at the cafe. When I finished, Daniels nodded and said, "You're very lucky, Roman. Without Mr. Harold Green, things could have been very different." That sentence left me silent. Yes, just 10 minutes earlier, and my life could have taken a terrifying turn. After signing the report, I walked out of the interrogation room with slightly trembling hands. One question kept echoing in my mind. If Harold hadn't been there, would I still be standing this firmly? Harold was waiting for me in the police station lobby, his hands tucked inside his old coat. When he saw me, he smiled, a simple smile like always. But I could sense the exhaustion behind it. I approached and whispered, "You've worked so hard." Harold waved his hand dismissively. "I just did the right thing." We walked out to the parking area together. I asked, "Have you ever been scammed like that?" Harold stopped walking. His eyes went distant, as if memories were pulling him into a dark place. "Not me," he answered. "My best friend." His voice dropped, roughened by the weight he was holding back. He trusted people too easily, and in the end, he lost everything. His money, his home, his family. I stood silent. The wind blowing through the trees made the leaves tremble, producing a sound filled with sorrow. Harold continued. "After that, I always blamed myself. I should have seen it earlier. I should have warned him more strongly. But I didn't do enough." I looked at him, understanding for the first time that what he did for me wasn't simply kindness. It was redemption, an attempt to prevent history from repeating itself. "You've done more than enough," I said. "Without you, I would have lost everything." Harold smiled faintly, but his eyes were slightly red. "Roman, you're a good man, and I don't want this world to take that away from you." That evening, I decided not to go home right away. I drove to La Jolla Beach and sat on a stone bench facing the night sea. The waves crashed rhythmically, and the ocean breeze was cold but strangely comforting. I thought about Harold, about the heartbreaking stories he told me. Part of me was filled with gratitude, but another part carried a haunting fear. The fear that I had walked dangerously close to a cliff, without even knowing. I remembered that while signing the report at the police station, Daniels showed me some old case files. When he flipped to the last page, I saw a photograph of an elderly man with tired eyes sitting in front of a nearly collapsed house. That was the friend Harold had mentioned. I had never met him, but looking at that face, I understood Harold's old fear. I sat there watching the waves crash onto the shore until the sky turned completely dark. Never in my life had I felt how fragile life could be. And never had I appreciated someone as much as I did Harold in that moment. When I returned to my apartment, I lay in bed but couldn't sleep. I thought about how Harold had followed the situation from the beginning, quietly gathering evidence just to protect me, a near stranger. I thought about the leftover meals I used to give him. I once believed they meant nothing, but in reality that small act was the reason my life turned in a different direction. Without that connection, Harold would not have cared so deeply. And I might not be standing here. At that moment, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I owed Harold more than gratitude. I owed him a part of my life, and I had to do something to give back. I couldn't stop thinking about Harold for many days afterward. The stories he told, the sadness in his eyes, and the pain he carried like a scar that would never heal, all of it haunted me. One evening after work, when I walked into the lobby, I saw Harold reaching up to change a burnt-out ceiling light. His hands trembled a little, and the metal ladder wobbled slightly. My heart skipped a beat. I ran over. "Let me do it," I said. Harold laughed. "I'm still strong." But I could clearly see the exhaustion on his face. After I helped him finish replacing the bulb, he invited me to sit. "Roman, are you busy tonight?" I shook my head. "No. Do you need something?" He hesitated for a few seconds, then said, "I want you to come to my house for a bit. There are things I want to show you." It felt like another door in Harold's life was about to open. I nodded. We arrived in Chula Vista around 8. The road leading to Harold's house was quiet, lined with trees rustling in the wind. His small house sat at the end, old and dim, but a warm yellow light shone from its window. When Harold opened the door, Buddy immediately ran out, its legs weak but its tail still wagging. I bent down to pet it, and it rested its head on my hand as if it had known me forever. Inside the house there was the scent of old wood, books, and a hint of veterinary medicine. The space was small but warm in a unique way. Harold pointed to the chair opposite him. "Sit. I'll make tea." When he returned, he carried a dark brown wooden box. He placed it on the table, his hands trembling slightly. "Roman, it's time you know why I care about you so much." I sat upright. Harold opened the box. Inside were old photographs, faded letters, and an aged certificate. He took out the first photo, him and a young woman with long hair and a gentle smile. "This is Mary, my wife," Harold said. I saw in his eyes a softness I had never seen before. She was the one who made me believe a man could become better every day. He set the photo aside and pulled out the next one, him in a military uniform, standing straight. "When I was young, I served in the army. When I returned, I worked many jobs and eventually became a security guard because I thought simply, I just want to keep people safe." Harold took out another picture, this time of Buddy when it was small, running across the lawn. He chuckled softly. "Buddy came to me after Mary passed. It helped me feel less alone." He gently stroked the box, as if stroking a piece of his past. Then he took out a folded letter. "Roman, I've never told anyone in the building this." His voice slowed. "After Mary died, I nearly gave up on everything. I used to sit in this house for hours, thinking my life no longer had meaning. There were times I didn't want to live anymore." That sentence chilled me. I looked at Harold, truly sensing the loneliness he had carried. He continued, "Until one day, while I was working a night shift at the old building, a young employee handed me his leftover meal. He didn't say much, just placed it on the table and walked away." Harold looked at me, his eyes deep and sad. It was a small gesture, but it reminded me that I still existed in someone's eyes. I stayed silent. Every word he said carved itself into me. He continued, his voice even softer. "When I moved to the current building, I didn't expect much. But then you appeared. The first day you smiled and greeted me. You know, it had been a long time since anyone greeted me like that. My throat tightened. Harold let out a faint, regretful smile. And then you brought me leftover meals every night. I know they were just leftovers, but to me, they reminded me that I was still alive, that someone still saw me. I couldn't speak. My heart felt tight, filled with an emotion I couldn't name. Harold took out an old envelope, pulled out an old volunteer certificate, then placed it back. Roman, I once promised myself that if I could ever protect someone the way others once protected me, I would do it to the end. When I saw you with Tracy and Alex, I knew what I had to do. He looked up at me, his aging eyes filled with absolute sincerity. You saved me in a way you don't know, and I was only giving that back. My eyes burned, but I tried to hold myself together. I stood, walked closer to him. You don't owe me anything, I whispered. But I owe you a lot. Harold placed his warm, trembling hand on my shoulder. Roman, you don't owe me anything. Just live well. That's enough. I looked around his old house, at Buddy curled in the corner, at the photos full of memories. For the first time, I realized Harold wasn't just a kind security guard at the lobby. He was someone who had gone through pain, loss, loneliness, and still chose kindness. When I left his house that night, I stepped into the yard and looked at the starry Chula Vista sky. A strange feeling washed over me. Warmth, connection, deep gratitude. I knew my life had changed, not just because Harold saved me from a scam, but because he showed me this truth. Sometimes, a small action can save another person's soul. And maybe, now it was my turn to return that kindness. Ever since the night I visited Harold's house, a clear urge had formed inside me. I needed to do something for him. Not out of gratitude, not out of debt, but because I sensed that Harold had given so much of himself silently throughout his life, yet received very little in return. The next morning, when I walked into the lobby, I saw Harold sitting in his usual chair, drinking his cheap cup of coffee. I stood watching him a few seconds longer than usual, then walked over. Harold, can I take you out for dinner tonight? He looked surprised, then chuckled. Dinner? I thought you only knew how to bring me leftovers. His tone was joking, but I heard warmth inside it. I answered, No, tonight I'm inviting you properly. You pick the place. Harold shook his head. If you let me choose, I'll pick that $5 burger truck on the corner. I laughed. As long as you agree. He nodded. All right, see you tonight. That entire day, I couldn't focus on my work. I thought about Harold, about his old house, about the photos and letters he showed me. It felt like I was seeing him with completely new eyes. He wasn't just the old security guard anymore. He was a man who had lived through pain so deep he had to remind himself to stay strong, and still chose to quietly help others. And now, though he didn't say it, I knew he still lived alone in a long, lonely quiet. By late afternoon, I left work a little early. On the way home, I bought a bag of snacks for Buddy, a few healthy drinks for older adults, and a new coat, something I knew Harold would never buy for himself. I still remembered the worn coat he wore at the police station, thin and nearly torn at the shoulder. At 7, Harold was already waiting on the corner. The San Diego evening was chilly, with a gentle ocean breeze. When he saw me, he smiled and patted my shoulder. I'm an old man, and yet you're dragging me to dinner. How strange. We walked together to the burger truck he mentioned. It was small, with a few folding tables placed beside it, lit by warm yellow bulbs that made everything feel simple and comforting. As we sat, Harold said, You know, no one has ever taken me out to dinner. I usually eat alone, or with Buddy. His words made me go silent for a moment. Not out of pity, but because I realized that truth had existed for years. I set the menu down. Eat whatever you want. I'm treating. Harold laughed. Careful. I eat a lot. While waiting for food, we talked like two old friends. Harold told me about his younger years, about road trips with Mary, about how they once dreamed of opening a cafe but never had the means. He spoke about his early days as a security guard, the people he met, and the life lessons he never forgot. I listened to every story, feeling as if I were reading a long, heartfelt book. When the food arrived, Harold took a bite and said, "You know, I used to think there wasn't much left to look forward to in my life. But it turns out, there still is." He looked at me and smiled softly. "Thank you for treating me like I still matter." Those words made me look down to hide the emotion tightening my throat. People sometimes need just one person to truly see them, and that alone can save an entire wandering life. After dinner, I handed Harold the bag for Buddy and the coat I bought. He stared at the coat for a long moment, then said quietly, "Roman, you didn't have to do this." I replied, "I didn't have to. I wanted to." Harold smiled, this time with eyes glistening. He slowly put the coat on. "You're too kind for your own good." We walked back toward the building. At the entrance, Harold turned to me, his voice deep and sincere. "Roman, you may not believe this, but you've changed my life in ways you'll never fully understand." I looked at him and said, "You've changed mine too." Harold stayed silent for a few seconds, then exhaled softly, as if releasing an old burden. "For the first time in many years, I don't feel alone anymore." I stood there under the San Diego nightlights, looking at this older man who seemed fragile yet strong. And I realized that sometimes the people who seem the smallest carry the biggest hearts. Harold saved me from a terrible downfall, but the bigger gift he gave me was a reminder of the meaning of kindness. When I returned to my apartment that night, I knew one thing for certain. The story between Harold and me wasn't over yet. Something was leading us toward a new turning point. A moment I couldn't name yet, but I felt it coming. 1 week after the dinner with Harold, I realized something very clearly. His life wasn't just lacking in material comfort. It lacked connection, care, and the feeling of belonging anywhere. I wondered how long it had been since Harold last rested properly. How long since someone asked if he was okay. How long since he had a meal without sitting alone. I began paying more attention to him. Every morning, Harold arrived at the building earlier than anyone else. He cleaned, checked cameras, wiped the glass doors, then sat in his chair with the same cheap coffee as if it were a permanent part of his existence. But I also noticed he coughed more often, walked more slowly, and sometimes pressed his hand against the left side of his chest, as if something hurt quietly inside him. One afternoon when I went down to pick up a package, I saw Harold slightly slumped over, hand on his chest. I ran to him. "Harold, are you okay?" He looked up and forced a smile. "I'm fine, just a little tired." But I saw the sweat on his forehead even though the weather wasn't warm. I sat beside him. "You need to get checked. No more ignoring this." Harold waved me off. "I'm old. A bit of fatigue is normal." But I didn't accept that. "You're coming with me, now." My voice was firmer than usual, and Harold looked at me for a long moment before sighing. All right, I'll go." I drove him straight to Sharp Memorial Hospital. In the exam room, Harold sat quietly like a child waiting to be scolded. I sat beside him, anxious. When the doctor entered with the scan results, I saw his expression shift. Not severely serious, but not light either. "Mr. Green," the doctor said, "your heart has been weakened for some time. You need more rest and absolutely no heavy work. I also recommend reducing your work hours, or stopping entirely." Harold said nothing. No protest, no questions, just silence. I looked at him and saw his eyes sink slightly, as if the doctor had taken something important from him. His job wasn't just a job. It was how he felt useful. Without it, he feared becoming nothing. On the drive back, Harold remained quiet. When we reached his house in Chula Vista, he finally spoke. "Roman, if I don't work as a security guard anymore, what am I?" The question hit me hard. I stopped the car, turned to him. "You're Harold, the best man I've ever met. The man who saved me from a terrible mistake. The man whose heart is bigger than his own pain. You're valuable because you are you, not because of your job." Harold looked out the window, then whispered, "I'm scared that if I stop working, I'll be alone again." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "You won't be alone anymore, I promise. That day I stayed at his house until late. We talked about options for his job. I said, "You can work part-time, or switch to a lighter position." Harold stayed quiet, then nodded slowly. "I'll try." A few days later, I spoke to the building management on Harold's behalf. Fortunately, they cared about him deeply. Not only did they agree to reduce his hours, they offered him lighter duties. When I told Harold, he was quiet for a long moment, then whispered, "Thank you, Roman. You gave me more time and more hope." From that day on, I visited him more. I often brought dinner, walked buddy with him, or simply sat on the porch talking about small things in life. Harold began looking healthier, coughing less, and his spirits seemed brighter. One evening he said, "You know, I once thought the last years of my life would be sad. But now, I don't think that anymore." I looked at him, feeling an unfamiliar warmth. And then, one bright afternoon, I decided to do something bigger. I went to Harold's house, nervous but determined. When he opened the door, I said, "Harold, come with me. Just for a bit." He looked confused but followed. I drove to a small housing complex not far from our building. There was a ground-floor apartment, small but bright, with large windows facing a garden. I placed the keys in his hand. "Move here," I said. "It's close to work, close to me. No more loneliness." Harold froze completely. "Roman, what are you doing?" His voice trembled. "I didn't buy you a house," I said. "I just paid for the first year. I want you to have something better, safer. The rest, we'll figure out later." Harold stared at the keys, then at me. His eyes turned red. I don't know what to say." I smiled. "You don't have to say anything. Just live, stay healthy, and let me be a small part of your life." Harold hugged me, slowly, warmly, with trembling hands. It was the kind of hug someone holds inside their chest for years but never gives away. When Harold moved into the new apartment, Buddy ran around like a happy child, and Harold stood in the living room, looking at the walls and the garden with the eyes of someone who finally found a home after years of drifting. That night, as I prepared to leave, Harold said, "Roman, you didn't just save me. You gave me a whole new life." I answered, "You saved me too, just in a way I'll never forget." As I stepped outside, the San Diego wind brushed past me. Above, the stars sparkled like little dots connecting two lives that had once been strangers, yet somehow rescued one another. And I understood that our story wasn't just about the scam I nearly fell into. It was about two wounded lives meeting at the perfect time. That kindness, no matter how small, can reshape the fate of another person. And sometimes, it saves both.